All right, but tonight is the art of being alone and together, which is interesting, I think. Here's where we've been. We talked about the art of thinking on our first night and technologies of thought. So we talked about how the medium of communication shapes the mode of your thinking, whether it's orality, literacy, and writing and print, or what the theorists called secondary orality, which is video, basically. And then we went through some logical fallacies, which we all commit every day, and which can be weaponized. Logical fallacies can be weaponized into political campaigns, very successful ones usually. But in the end, the issue we discovered was, what's the game you're playing here? So are you trying to get to some sort of truth? Are you trying to find your way out of yourself, basically, and your preconceived notions? If you are, then there are certain ways to do that we talked about, from Plato to Aristotle to others. If you're not, then you should say that, or at least you should be exposed. I'm looking at you, Twitter. I'm looking at you, cable news. I'm looking at you, Facebook. So much of what I see on in that media is people bringing a hammer to a chess match, right? Two different games are being played here. You know Abraham Maslow's great saying, to someone with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So if you got this one tool, you're going to make it work everywhere, right? And again, I'm looking at you, Twitter. Then we talked about the art of speaking, and I dragged you through a wild ride from Plato's Cratylus through Aristotle's rhetoric to Roland Barthes' semiotics to Jean Baudrillard's simulacra and simulation. We don't have to go over that. Again, I know it was painful, but it did get us to, I think, an important point, is that if you try to build a theology, a philosophy, really anything permanent and absolute on words, it's going to fail. Because the ultimate reality, whatever you want to call it, God, truth, the mysterious being, the flying spaghetti monster, is going to be outside of that linguistic system. And we read Jacques Derrida, there is no outside text. So mystics have known this for millennia, is that the words, you must surpass the words, because the words aren't the thing. They are a way to the thing. All right, so tonight, solitude and being together, because there's really no way to talk about one without the other. Solitude, basically related to loneliness. All right, so we're gonna hear some great thinkers and doers talk about the nature of solitude, and most of them are going to distinguish it from loneliness. But I'm going with the etymology here. Being alone, lonely, a desert or a wilderness, that's important, as you'll see. So just basically alone. And then we've got Schopenhauer from The World as Will and Idea. A man can be himself only so long as he is alone. If he does not love solitude, he will not love freedom. For it is only when he or she is alone that he or she is really free. That's a good place to start. If you are not alone, you are not free. Interesting. And of course, interesting in the 1690s that a solitudinarian was a recluse or an unsocial person. And we still carry that notion that if you value or practice your solitude, you only get so much of that before people are going to start asking you about it. Like, what's up, dude? Like, why didn't you come to the party? Why didn't you come to the Dodger game? Why didn't you go out with us on Halloween? I don't know if you've ever experienced that, but the group gets very nervous if you withdraw too much. And apparently that started happening in the 17th century. If I were wanting to go off on a wild hair, I'd say it has something to do with Descartes, but let's not go there. I think, therefore I am. The notion of the individual developing in the 17th century in modernism, philosophical modernism. Let's start with a unique character in history, Diogenes of Sinope. You've heard of Diogenes, probably? Really interesting guy, and an interesting place to start because he lived in Athens and Corinth. So you're like, well, what's he withdrawing from? Oh, he withdrew. Trust me, he withdrew from everyone, and he made a point of withdrawing from everyone. He had no possessions. He had no social relationships. He was pretty much a jerk. He really was. He took great pride in offending people. And the stories we have of him are all of him offending people, including famous people like Alexander and Plato. And that's a kind of solitude. It was basically a rejection of society while being in society. So in Athens, he lived in a bathtub. He lived in a bathtub in the streets. And of course, people would approach him, and he would just shoot them down terribly. Like, all right, so I wasn't going to say this, but then you can tell I'm struggling, so I know you're going to ask me what I was thinking. So let's just get this out of the way. Someone confronted him in the street one time, and rather than answer them, he defecated in the street, which was an answer, right?
It wasn't difficult to keep people away.
Well, he kept them away with his words, but yeah.
No, they didn't want to be violent.
They didn't want to be what?
Near him.
Yeah, that's right, except that he was so compelling, they were always coming up to him and asking him things like, the dude lived in a bathtub. Don't you want to know what that's about? Right? And people did, and wow. So there are a couple famous stories. There are many, many stories about Diogenes, the cynic. Like I said, he mocked civilization, solitude in the city. He lived a dog's life, which is the Greek word cynic. Kuniko is for dog, and so that's how the cynics were born. Plato, again, often interacts with Diogenes in Athens, at least. He had defined the human being as Plato and his students get together in the academy, and they're doing that Platonic thing, like, well, what is human being really? And so they go through this dialectic, and they end up saying, well, a human being is a featherless biped, as philosophers are wont to do. So what happened is Diogenes heard this. He goes and gets a chicken, plucks it, throws it to the academy and says, behold the man. Featherless biped, right? And then I guess the most famous story about Diogenes is that Alexander, the emperor, comes to see him. He's heard about him. And he's in his bathtub in Athens. And Alexander comes up and says, I'm Alexander the Great. And I've come all the way to see the man who is always looking. In the tarot, the hermit is a guy holding a lamp. That's Diogenes. He's looking for an honest man, right? So Alexander says, I've come to see the man who's looking for the honest man. And he says, he's got all his retinue with him and his soldiers and his bodyguards. And he says, is there anything I can do for you? And Diogenes looks up at him and says, yeah, you can get out of my light. You got to love this guy, right? He respects no one. Nothing sacred to him. And Alexander, a lot of this is lore. but that's all right. I love the stories better than the facts, frankly. Alexander's reported to have said, "Had I not been born Alexander, I should have liked to be Diogenes." Nice, right? Now, from the same area, not era, Epictetus. I would love for us to just sit one night and read through the Enchiridion, which is simply the Greek word for handbook, right? Epictetus wrote his book while he was in prison. While he was in slavery. He was a slave to Rome, and some of the most profound and practical words on the art of living that you will ever find. The Enchiridion is just a little short book, and he has a little section on what is solitude. And here it is. Being alone is not solitude. All right, because these writers, these thinkers, want solitude to be more than being alone, and that's right, isn't it? Because you can be alone but not be solitary, because you've got all these thoughts in your head, or you've got things buzzing around you, or just being alone, you might be seeing a lot of things and processing a lot of sense data. Since Epictetus, maybe even since Diogenes, we've wanted to, it's more than being alone. It's shutting off the voices in our head. It's shutting off our sense data or whatever. So he says, interestingly, solitude is a condition of a helpless person. Let's hear what he has to say here from the Enchiridion. For they do not understand how a person lives when he is alone. The people who don't practice solitude and are suspicious of people who do. They assume a certain natural principle, the natural desire of community and mutual love and the pleasure of conversation. Okay, well, yeah, those are good things, right? But nonetheless, a person ought to be prepared to be able to be sufficient for himself and to be his own companion. For Zeus dwells with himself and is tranquil by himself. I don't think Zeus is very tranquil, but okay. And thinks of his own administration and of his nature, and is employed in thoughts suitable to himself. So ought we to be able to talk with ourselves, right? Not to feel the want of others also, not to be without means of passing our time, to observe the divine administration and relation of ourselves to everything else. Nice. To consider how we formerly were affected toward things that happen and how, at present, we are still the things which give us pain. We are still the things which give us pain. How these also can be cured and how removed. If any things require improvement, and to improve them according to reason. Okay, I like that very much. When I think of my times of solitude, I think of pain, mostly, because we tend to go into solitude only as a result of exile, whether it's self-exile or some other kind of exile, rejected by a lover, rejected by an institution. And we retreat into solitude, and therefore we have the capability, at least, to retreat into ourselves. And I like that Epictetus says that it's the condition of being a helpless person. You almost have to become helpless to, well, not to go into solitude, but to appreciate solitude and its mystery. I think there's a certain helplessness that comes along, a certain loss, maybe we would say today. That you must experience loss to know solitude. And, as he says, to contemplate, really, the things which give us pain and how these can be cured and removed, right? Now, that's not to say that that can't happen in society, but as we'll see, that can happen uniquely when you're by yourself. Now, going forward about 15 centuries, there is Michel de Montaigne, the famous essayist, the original Renaissance man in many ways. Really interesting Frenchman, alive during the horrible wars, the Catholic Protestant wars in France. And he has a book of essays in which there's a section, there's one essay called On Solitude. He talks, he's an interesting person. Gustavo and I were talking about him the other day. He's in the midst of these horrific wars, the Catholic Protestant wars, and he just kind of stays out of it, you know. So he's a practical man. He's a Stoic, in fact. And, well, you just listen to him. The contagion of the crowd. The contagion of the crowd. I love this. Contagion is very dangerous in the crowds. Like, being around people is like submitting to a virus or opening yourself up to a virus. And, yeah, that's kind of true. Because one must either imitate the vicious or hate them. And he saw the vicious. One must either imitate the vicious or hate them. I find this really interesting in the age of social media. One must either imitate the vicious or hate them. But he says, both these things are dangerous. To imitate them because they are many, and to hate them because they are unlike us. And I think he would say, to hate them is to validate them in some way, right? So when you hate someone on social media, this goes back to the art of thinking, what you're really saying is, you affect me, right? You are saying something that affects me, because, you know, if it doesn't affect me, why do I even read it? Why do I even react to it? But you're touching something in me, and I think this is how social media largely works, is can you incite something in someone else, for good or ill? Continuing, the wise person will flee the crowd. Endure it if necessary, but given the choice, choose solitude. We are not sufficiently rid of vices to have to be contending with those of others. All right, so he's a very practical, very stoic man, philosophically stoic. I also like this. The aim of solitude is to live more at leisure and at one's ease. Let's just get it out there. Right? We just want to stay in bed and watch 30 Rock all day, you know, all 7 seasons, because that's nice and easy and funny, right? And then here he is again. Alone is not, here is this idea again. Alone is not solitude. It is not enough to have gotten away from the crowd. It is not enough to move. We must get away from the gregarious instincts that are within us. We must sequester ourselves and repossess ourselves. I don't know about you, but all my life I've been victim to the geography cure, right? Where I'm unhappy. So, like, I was in Montgomery, Alabama for a while. I'm like, if I could just leave Montgomery, Alabama, everything would be okay. And a lot was okay when I left Montgomery, Alabama. And you put on Bonnie Raitt's cover of John Prine's Angel from Montgomery, and that works really well. But the geography, the geography doesn't mean you change, because you're still with you, right? Just as Montaigne says here. We must get away from the gregarious instincts that are within us. We must sequester ourselves and repossess ourselves. I really like that language, to repossess ourselves, because lots of people and forces want to possess us, right? And solitude, I don't want to say it's the only way, but it's a vital way to repossess yourself, because you're cutting yourself off from those forces, hopefully, except for the internal ones, and then you can deal with those. This is probably his most famous quote about solitude. We must reserve a back shop all our own. A back shop. Shop in the back, you know? Entirely free, in which to establish our real liberty and our principal retreat and solitude. So, you know, Manly Hall here, and he was a very public figure when he was here and alive, and he had a magnificent office that is still magnificent, still have his desk in there. But he also had a private back room upstairs in the library, at a far corner where no one would pass, and he would retreat up there with some very special books. His back room, right? You need that. We all need that. Because we must become like an animal in a lair. I love this too. You can see why Montaigne's known as a good writer. He really has a really interesting economical style, but also very compelling images. We must do like the animals that rub out their traces at the entrance to their lairs. Nice. Seek no longer that the world should speak of you, right? So be willing to disappear from the world. But how you should speak to yourself. Seek that. Retire into yourself. But first prepare to receive yourself there, right? It would be madness to trust in yourself if you do not know how to govern yourself. So there are times for solitude, and there are times when you should not be alone because you don't know how to govern yourself. And being in solitude will only increase the chaos in your life, Montaigne says. Borrow nothing except from yourself. Arrest your mind and fix it on definite and limited thoughts, and rest content within them, without any desire to prolong life and reputation. All right? From a man who survived the Catholic-Protestant wars of the 16th century. Now, you probably, if you thought about the topic tonight, you probably thought about Thoreau. There is dates, you know him from Walden and probably other things. Walden was an exercise in solitude, for sure. Thoreau was not a fan of society. He was actually thrown in jail for refusing to pay his taxes in Concord. And let's just listen to what he had to say. I never found the companion that was so companionable as solitude. I don't know if you've ever been in that place, but I have certainly been in that place. Again, I think it's the result of pain and loss for most of us. And I don't know for Thoreau, but I would guess you can hear the pain, I think, in Walden when you read it, and in his journals. Never found the companion that was so companionable as solitude. Interesting, right? Not until we are lost, in other words, not until here's that notion again of pain and loss. Not till we are lost, in other words, not till we have lost the world do we begin to find ourselves and realize that we are the infinite extent of our relations. All right, so you must go in order to understand the outside world. We must become lost. Now, I know the critique of Thoreau. I've been to Walden Pond. I lived near there for a while. And it was that, that he lived near Emerson and would come in and eat dinner with Emerson and his family. And I don't care. That's not the point. The point isn't the geographical distance. The point is the spiritual distance, which I think he had. If you read Walden, you'll see that he had that. The psychological difference even. You think, he says, that I'm impoverishing myself by withdrawing from human beings, but in my solitude I have woven for myself a silken web or chrysalis, and nymph-like shall ere long burst forth a more perfect creature, fitted for a higher society. All right, so that's the interesting process here, is that it's rare to see someone retreat into solitude without some notion of coming back in some way, some higher society, or trying to re-engage the world in some way. Now, sure, it's not, there are monks and mystics who absolutely do not want that and do not seek it. But usually in the literature on solitude and retreat and hermits, you find that there's this sense of re-engagement. It happened with Siddhartha Gautama, That's how he found the middle way, the Buddha, is that he was a hermit, and then he saw other people being hedonists, and he found the middle way between, which is where you engage society, you don't retreat from it. Then there's our old friend Ralph Waldo Emerson, who wrote a book called Society and Solitude. Also, you know him from Self-Reliance in Nature and other great works. Thoreau's friend, companion, Walt Whitman's unwitting blurber on Leaves of Grass. Do you know this story? Whitman sent him, Emerson was well-known and well-respected leader of the Transcendentalist movement, and Whitman sent him Leaves of Grass, the first edition, and Emerson wrote him back. Now this is 1860 whatever, and Emerson wrote him back and said, "I congratulate you on the beginning of a great career." So Whitman put that on the next edition of the book. It was a private letter to Whitman, but Whitman, the first blurber, or learning how to use a blurb, steal a blurb, I should say. I'm just going to let Emerson speak for himself. I think you know him well enough, and these are some amazing thoughts on solitude. This is probably my favorite line from Emerson in all his works. "Trust thyself. Every heart vibrates to that iron string. Accept the place the divine providence has found for you, the society of your contemporaries, the connection of events. Great people have always done so and confided themselves childlike to the genius of their age." Now, that's an interesting little paradox there. Trust yourself, but accept the place that divine providence has found for you, the society of your contemporaries. So trust yourself, but realize you are situated. You're in a place, right? You're not alone, even though ultimately you must trust yourself. You must rely on yourself. You may know this one too. "Whoso would be a man must be a nonconformist. He who would gather immortal palms must not be hindered by the name of goodness, but must explore it if it be goodness, must explore whether it be goodness. Nothing is at last sacred but the integrity of your own mind." Nothing is at last sacred but the integrity of your own mind. Isn't that just pragmatically true? I mean, isn't that ultimately that's the final arbiter, isn't it? The integrity of your own. Does it make sense to you? Can you weigh this out and transform it into action, or just be content with yourself? And again, that's a product of solitude. Insist on yourself, never imitate. Your own gift you can present every moment with the cumulative force of a whole life's cultivation. But of the adopted talent of another, you have only an extemporaneous half-possession. Nothing can bring you peace but yourself. Nothing can bring you peace but the triumph of principles. Nothing can bring you peace but yourself. In another place he says, "Do not seek yourself outside yourself." If we could live according to that one simple sentence, right? Nothing can bring you peace but yourself. I know for me, when I'm not at peace, I'm blaming someone else, or I'm blaming the world, or I'm blaming the Republican Party, or I'm blaming Houston Astros, or something, right? Nothing can bring you peace but yourself. And yet, again, as we saw in the first quotation, friendship has its place. "Only that soul can be my friend, which I encounter on the line of my only march. That soul to which I do not decline, and which does not decline to me, but nature of the same celestial latitude, repeats in its own all my experience." So, friends are rare, basically. Only those on the same celestial latitude, right? Only those who do not decline to you and do not ask you to decline to them. You know, what it's like to make a friend. Sometimes being a friend means you have to support a person in her illusions, right? Even though if you know better. And, there's a place for that, especially if you're overwhelmed by life, where someone just needs support, and it doesn't matter if you lie. Things are going to be okay. Yeah, he's a bastard. Yeah, you're better off without him. You know what I'm talking about. But not for Emerson. That's not true friendship. Friendship is recognizing what you find in solitude, right? It's recognizing what others have found in that process of solitude. Now, at the same time, we have the great American poet Emily Dickinson, 1830 to 1866, 1,775 poems, unknown. Nobody really knew she was writing these poems. She was sequestered pretty much to her room in Amherst, Massachusetts. Her father was overly protective, and there's a lot of father-daughter stuff there that we won't get into. But what happened is it was a forced solitude. We're going to talk about this in relation to women as we go along. The forced solitude of women. So you may know her bedroom window, to which she was pretty much consigned, overlooked the cemetery there. So, Socrates said the true philosopher studies death. Well, Emily got to look out on the cemetery every day. By the way, if you know the poet Billy Collins, he has an amazing poem called Undressing Emily Dickinson, which is a metaphor for understanding Emily Dickinson. Anyway, listen to some of her poetry if you haven't heard it in a while, and think of it in terms of solitude. The soul selects her own society, then shuts the door. To her divine majority, present no more. It's really dense poetry. You got to kind of, doesn't read well when you speak it out loud because there are too many dashes. Solitude of space. There is a solitude of space, a solitude of sea, a solitude of death, but these societies shall be compared with that profounder sight, that polar privacy, a soul admitted to itself, finite infinity. Growth of man, like growth of nature, gravitates within. Atmosphere and sun endorse it, but stir alone. Each its difficult ideal must achieve itself through the solitary prowess of a silent life. So Dickinson's consigned to her room for the most part. She's overlooking a cemetery. She's a woman in the mid-19th century. Her options are severely limited. And she probably found love a few times, but it was rejected. And so she just has her solitude, her forced solitude, which she turns into sacred space and time, I think. And so my favorite poem, if you'll allow it, from Dickinson, about solitude. I'm nobody. Who are you? I'm nobody too. Don't tell anyone. They'll banish us, you know. How dreary to be somebody. How public, like a frog. To tell one's name the livelong June to an admiring bog. Fantastic, right? I'm nobody. Who are you? I use that line on people all the time. I remember I was in a coffee shop somewhere and a woman came and sat by me and said, "Can I tell you something about the Bible?" And I said, "No, I'm good." And and she said, "Well, did you know this and this?" And I said, "Well, actually, you're quoting 1 Peter and 1 John, and in the original Greek it reads this." And she's like, "Who are you?" And I said, "I'm nobody. Who are you?" Thank you, John. Amen corner over here. And then tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Wonderful. Tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Success in circuit lies, too bright for our infirm delight, the truth's superb surprise. As lightning to the children eased with explanation kind, the truth must dazzle gradually, or every man be blind. Nice, right? Elizabeth Cady Stanton? What? Yes, actually, she wrote an essay called The Solitude of the Self, 1815 to 1902. In 1892, you may know her as a leader in the suffrage movement. She resigned from that movement because she thought the political focus was too narrow. She thought that women's liberation was about more than political liberation. It was about spiritual, psychological, philosophical, mysterious liberation. The ability to, well, let me just let her talk. She said equality, this is really interesting, equality is based on solitude, on the notion that we are isolated by nature. And she's right, we are alone. You've got to walk that lonesome valley. You've got to walk it by yourself. No one else can walk it for you. Remember that old hymn? Thank you. This is Stanton, listen to this. The isolation of every human soul and the necessity of self-dependence must give each individual the right to choose his own surroundings. That's a really interesting political argument, isn't it? The isolation of every human soul and the necessity of self-dependence must give each individual the right to choose his own surroundings. The strongest reason for giving woman all the opportunities for higher education, etc., is the solitude and personal responsibility of her own life. It's kind of a libertarian argument, but it's actually much stronger, I think, than a libertarian argument because it's based in a philosophical notion that's hard to refute of ultimate self-dependence. She says again, no mortal has ever been, nor mortal shall ever be, like the soul just launched on the sea of life. Nature never repeats herself, and the possibilities of one human soul will never be found in another. The possibilities of one human soul will never be found in another. Now, this is very much a romantic notion. I don't know if she could have written that after the Romantic movement. But that doesn't matter. It's a unique thing in the world, just as we are unique things in the world. This notion that each of us has a path in life that is unlike any other is a powerful notion. And again, she's using it to make a political point along the way to making a larger philosophical point, is that your experiences on this planet are unique. That should give you certain rights, shouldn't it? She said. And she continues. The solitude isn't a good in itself, she says. The chief reason for opening to every soul the doors to the whole round of human duties and pleasures is the individual development thus attained. The individual development thus attained. So it's not solitude for its own sake. It's solitude for the sake of development. The resources thus provided under all circumstances to mitigate the solitude that at times must come to everyone, to mitigate it. So solitude is where we begin. It is our essential default setting, and yet it is not sufficient. We must rise beyond it. But to do that, we must each recognize that fact in others, that we live alone, that we are self-dependent. And we must construct a society and a nation that allows for that nurturing. Pretty powerful stuff, right? Rilke, Letters to a Young Poet. You may have heard Duino Elegies. You can see we're moving roughly chronologically here. And you may have heard of some of these quotations from Rilke, but again, with poets, I don't want to talk too much about them because they've kind of said everything in their poetry. Love the questions, Rilke says. Try to love the questions themselves. This is Letters to a Young Poet. Try to love the questions themselves. Live the questions now. Perhaps then, someday far in the future, you will gradually, without even noticing, live your way into the answer. I love that. Love the questions, live the questions, and you will live yourself into the answer. But everything that may someday be possible for many people, the solitary can now already prepare and build with his own hands, which make fewer mistakes. Therefore, love your solitude and try to sing out with the pain it causes you. Therefore, love your solitude and try to sing out with the pain that it causes you. Because solitude, as we said at the beginning, is almost always associated with pain and loss. So what do? Do you take that solitude? Do you nurture the pain? Do you measure it against some ideal? No. Rilke says, sing it out. Love your solitude. Try to sing out with the pain it causes you. I don't know if you've ever done that, but I've done that. One of the greatest losses and pains in my life. I was in solitude, and I spoke it. I spoke it out. I wandered the halls of my house like Roderick Usher in the Edgar Allan Poe story, just saying everything that was hurting me, just saying it out loud. Right? Rilke knew that. If there is nothing you can share with other people, try to be close to things. Right? Try to be close to things. I love this because that's not what you're supposed to say, right? You're supposed to be close to other people because they're going to help you, not for Rilke. If there's nothing you can share with other people, try to be close to things. Things will not abandon you. This dude's been hurt, right? The nights are still there, and the winds that move through the trees and across many lands. Everything in the world of things and animals is filled with being, of which you are a part, but apparently not other people. But you see his point. There's a quietness in things, right? Or if not a quietness, then another voice, a different kind of music or sound. And that turns off your voice, right, that you participate in when you're in society. I think he's right about that too. He's kind of the classic poet who says, leave me alone and let me write my poetry. He says this, I beg all those who love me to love my solitude too. So, okay, you love me, great, leave me alone. For otherwise, I would have to conceal myself even from their eyes and hands, like a wild animal hiding from enemies bent on its capture. Dude, all right, okay, write your poetry. It's good poetry. This is from the Book of Images. Just listen. Solitude is like the rain rising from the sea to meet the nightfall from the dim, far distant plain. Solitude falls like rain in that gray, doubtful hour when the streets all turn into dawn, when those who are hopeless and forlorn and sorrowfully alone, when all men who hate each other creep together into a common bed for sleep, while solitude flows onwards with the rivers. Damn, good stuff. One of my favorite passages from Rilke. Who, if I cried out, would hear me among the angels' hierarchy? And even in one of them press me suddenly against his heart, I would be consumed in that overwhelming existence. For beauty is nothing but the beginning of terror, which we are still just able to endure. And we are so awed because it serenely disdains to annihilate us. Every angel is terrified. I love that. We are so awed because it serenely disdains to annihilate us. Do you know that feeling? Do you know when you see the universe and its power and your finite nature, your limited nature, and you think, this could kill me right now. This massive set of forces arrayed against me, but it serenely, that's the key word, the adverb, it serenely disdains to annihilate me. I love that, right? The universe is so far beyond me, but it serenely disdains to annihilate me. Well, I think that's a religious moment. We could not talk about solitude without talking about Virginia Woolf, who in her essay, A Room of One's Own, really articulated what this means for women. And she did it in her brilliant way. She begins, a woman must have money and a room of her own if she is to write fiction. All right, so this is Woolf's writing at the beginning of the 20th century. She's modernist, British modernist. And she begins the essay, interestingly, she says, she's not the narrator. This is the narrator speaking. Call me Mary Bakhtin, Mary Seton, Mary Carmichael, or any other name you please. It is not a matter of importance. Which is the point of the essay, one point of the essay, is that as a woman writer, her name is not a matter of importance. The narrator is not, the person telling the story, because she's a woman, is not a matter of importance. Let me just let her speak. One must strain off what was personal and accidental in these impressions, and so reach the pure fluid, the essential oil of the truth. So she casts this story, she casts this essay in terms of the story where she goes to the British Museum, and she wants to find women writers, and she can't find any. And in fact, while she's there, she's told by a stern gentleman that only men are allowed to only men are allowed to sit on the grass. Women must stay on the sidewalk, because she was apparently sitting down reading on the grass. And all this, of course, feeds into the notion that women have been invisible in history, but not because they did not try. It was simply because they did not have a room of their own. And so she talks about Judith Shakespeare. You've heard of Judith Shakespeare, right? No, you haven't, because it's Shakespeare's sister. Shakespeare's imagined sister in the narrator's mind. And she says, it would have been impossible, completely and entirely, for any woman to have written the plays of Shakespeare in the age of Shakespeare. Why? Because there was no private space for women. There was none. Women were charged with raising a family, taking care of the husband, not to mention not having access to writing and publishing. Life for both sexes, and I look at them shouldering their way along the pavement, is arduous, says the narrator. Difficult, a perpetual struggle. It calls for gigantic courage and strength. More than anything, perhaps, creatures of illusion that we are, it calls for confidence in oneself, right? So all those things that Emerson and Thoreau and Epictetus said about the necessity of being alone applies even more so to women, because they don't have a space for being alone. They literally do not have a room of their own. And that's why Woolf says there hasn't been, in her time, there had not been many women writers. Now, I had not heard of this guy until I started doing this research. Apparently, John Cowper Powys was a prolific novelist in the early part of the 20th century. Anybody heard of him? You have? Yeah? Apparently he was known for these large plotting novels that went in 14 different directions, which I haven't read. But he also wrote a book called A Philosophy of Solitude. And he had some really interesting thoughts. For example, that solitude again, you're seeing themes here. You're seeing connections between these thoughts on solitude, and we'll talk about them soon in the discussion. The soul that has recreated itself in isolation. So it's about solitude can produce the recreation of the soul. And when that happens, the soul has gained something of the humility of the grass, the rocks, and the winds. All right, this is a common theme we're hearing, right? Is that when you go into solitude, you disconnect from society, but you reconnect with the universe, or at least the earth. You reconnect with that, and thus enlarge yourself. Whitman, right? All that lives is holy unto it. And it realizes, the soul, taught by the innumerable voices of nature, a certain ultimate equality in everything that draws breath. Well, we talk about that here all the time, right? That's religious experience. That's mystical understanding. That's the moment, right, where you realize you are the one. He says this, and I think it's brilliant. We need to create substitutes for all the spiritual satisfactions that the old mythologies gave us. Yeah, we were talking about this in the library this week too, is how we haven't really found an effective replacement for the loss of ritual and myth in our society. It's still there. There are still rituals, there are still myths, but on a societal scale, we don't have it, and we're trying to substitute. Again, I don't mean to always pick on social media, but I find it fascinating and troubling. Social media is a kind of storytelling medium, right? You're trying to tell the story. You're trying to tell your story, and you're doing so by defining it against other stories, but that's another thing. And it's because we don't have the storytelling structures that we did. Now, I think we have some that are much better. Television and film, for example, are incredible storytelling mediums, but they are also problematic because they're commercialized, etc. You know what I'm talking about. But Alain de Botton is working on this. I don't know if you know him. Wrote a great book called The Art of Travel, and he's founded something called the School of Life, which is, isn't it great? So he is literally, he's an atheist, and he's literally trying to recreate the functions of religion, but without God, without spirituality. I don't know if he would say without spirituality, but without God. And so he's trying to do what Powys says. All the nobler instincts, this is Powys, of our race are born in solitude and subdued by silence. Born in solitude, subdued by silence. So silence we didn't talk about. Hard to talk about silence, right? But that seems to be a part of it, the silencing of the societal voices and then ultimately your own voices. This guy's, I got to find out more about this guy. So he ends the book by saying, close this book and release your soul upon the rain that streams against your window. You are within walls, but there is rain upon the journeying wind. Rain that brings a sense of moss-covered stones, of blind, dark turf, of vast rondeurs of drenched horizons. Damn, that's pretty good, right? Look at him. He looks pretty intense. All right. Nicholas Berdyaev, another Russian philosopher. I didn't know this series was going to be so much about Russian philosophers, but that's cool because they're brilliant. Bakhtin and now Berdyaev wrote a book called Solitude in Society. And this is philosophical in that he's building an argument. And so the first half of the book is not even about solitude. It's about the human situation. Let me just read it. The philosopher's tragic situation. These are the chapters, actually. These 5 elements here are the chapters of the book. The philosopher's tragic situation is that the objectifying criterion of both religion and science excludes true knowledge that springs from the personal, individual experience of the mystery of being. Now, philosophers like Berdyaev are arguing against other philosophers. And this may seem odd to you that you have to argue for the personal, individual experience. But you do in philosophy. And he's picking up the mantle of Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher theologian from the 19th century, who is famous for saying that the great systemizing philosopher Hegel, that he argued with mostly, great systemizing philosopher, huge books, big concepts, all built upon one another, and all very much abstracted from experience. Kierkegaard was famous for saying that Hegel had built a castle in his philosophy, but he lived in a shack next door. Right? I think that's the most devastating critique of philosophy I've ever heard. Berdyaev is in the same mode. In fact, he speaks of Kierkegaard as the founder of what he's trying to do. So yes, in philosophy, you actually have to argue for the personal and the individual. At least Kierkegaard was the first to do that in millennia, right? So again, philosophy is weird, but we're getting there. Subject to an objectification. Again, I'm not going to read this, but he's basically making an argument for existentialism, which one has to do, again, in philosophy, that you should not discount your experience, simply, which, remember, Plato said is worth nothing. And in fact, I was reading to some students last week the Phaedo, where Plato's about to die. He's just been sentenced by the council to die. And he's arguing about the soul still. And Plato says that the soul, this eternal, ultimately immutable connection to the ultimate truth, goodness, and beauty, can be weighed down by the body. It's an interesting argument. So that if your soul gets lost in your bodily appetites, then you've lost your soul to your body, right? Berdyaev and Kierkegaard and Nietzsche and others are railing against this notion that you should discount the body, because to discount the body is to discount your experience in the world. Why would you want to discount that, right? When it's your life, right? And so Berdyaev's coming out of that tradition. Interestingly, the ego, solitude, and society, he says, the pursuit of knowledge is undoubtedly one of the ways of overcoming solitude, the pursuit of knowledge. It compels us to abandon our self-centered isolation. We talked about this in The Art of Thinking, and situates us in another space and time where we are brought into contact with the other self. It is an escape from solitude, a way of getting to know the other ego, the divine world. So again, we're seeing some themes here. So you retreat into solitude, but you don't stay there. You must reconnect. But Berdyaev wants us to reconnect with something higher, right? Not ordinary society as we typically experience it. As life becomes more technical and mechanical, he says, so the evil of time becomes increasingly virulent. I think you know that, right? How time has been colonized by technology. How we thought email was going to be awesome because we could get it quicker and easier. We could get messages from our colleagues and friends, and now it has us. I can't even say email because that's passé now, I guess. I guess it would be text messaging. Or for the youth, Snapchat, I'm told. But the virulence of time, the evil of time, as we become more technical and mechanical. Don DeLillo has a great line on this from his novel White Noise. So technology is lust removed from nature. Technology is lust removed from nature. So there's a sterility to technology that takes away passion. while we're on the subject, McLuhan, we talked about McLuhan the first night in The Art of Thinking. I forgot to give you his greatest quote, which is that human beings are the sex organs of technology. So there. And then finally, solitude, Berdyaev. Solitude is the direct outcome of the pressure exerted on the personality by the natural and social worlds. We are driven into solitude, of its conversion into object. But the most mature personality will be conscious of a necessary solitude as an apartness from both nature and society, even when a sense of communion alleviates the nostalgia associated with solitude. So here again is that process of retreat and return, but not return to the same place, because you return different. What does that sound like? The hero's journey, right? Yeah. All right, I'm going to close up really quickly here with, only two more people who've written about solitude. Anthony Storr is a psychologist who wrote this book, Solitude: A Return to the Self, and as a psychologist emphasizes human relationships. And it's a long book, and he's taking some time to work through his thesis. But basically, I've distilled it. He would hate this, but I've distilled it down to this. And here's a quote on human relationships. It's widely believed that interpersonal relationships of an intimate kind are the chief, if not the only, source of human happiness. Yet the lives of creative individuals seem to run counter to this assumption. Looking at you, Rilke, right? So here's really the linchpin of the solitude society issue, is what does society cost you? And what does solitude cost you in the big picture? The capacity to form attachments on equal terms is considered evidence of emotional maturity. It is the absence of this capacity which is pathological. Again, if you demand your solitude, society will not like that. Whether there may be other criteria of emotional maturity, like the capacity to be alone, is seldom taken into account. It means in psychology, in the writings of psychology. So the notion that you should be alone rarely comes up, he says. And again, he's interested in particular in creative people. The creative person, he says, is constantly seeking to discover himself, to remodel his own identity, to find meaning in the universe through what he creates. He finds this a valuable integrating process which, like meditation or prayer, has little to do with other people, but which has its own separate validity. His most significant moments are those in which he attains some new insight or makes some new discovery. And these moments are chiefly, if not invariably, those in which he is alone. Okay, so we know this motif, right? That you must retreat, you must go into your quietude and to be creative, all right? And we're going to have a separate talk on that, but I think we know that now. We know that paradigm anyway. And then Philip Koch, Solitude: A Philosophical Encounter. I don't know that I can recommend this book because it's very, slow, but not in a bad way. I mean, if you want to linger over a philosophical treatise on solitude, I do recommend the book because it's philosophical writing, but it's also personal writing, and so he's really trying to integrate his personal life and experiences with these philosophical concepts, and he reads everyone. He reads poetry, he reads philosophical texts, he reads everything. Other people's experiences, memoirs, etc. So just briefly, he's saying a brief definition. So if he's a philosopher, that's the first thing he's going to do is define his term. Let this stand then as a brief definition. Solitude is the state in which experience is disengaged from other people. And he goes into pages and pages of what that means, because he wants to do what we've seen other people here in this slide deck do. He wants to make sure that solitude isn't simply aloneness, right? It must be disengagement. So you must not engage with the concerns of society and with the concerns of your little society around you. And he says, being a good philosopher, that there are 4 criteria of disengagement: perceptual, cognitive, emotional, and actional. And then he says, being a good philosopher, that these are fairly rare to find in concert. Now, his most interesting contribution, I think, to the book is a section toward the end called Women in Solitude. And again, we've seen this come up in our brief survey, and I applaud him for dealing with this. Here's what he says. There's an idea that runs deep through Western culture, an idea that vigorously denies the universality of the value of solitude. Simply put, the idea that solitude is not valuable for women. Solitude, it insists, has always been a male prerogative, a male rite of passage, a male quest for self-knowledge and cosmic wisdom. In a woman, a passion for solitude has been thought unnatural and dangerous, contrary to her nurturant genius and tending towards evil. Why is it always evil? Sorry, there's always... Anyway. Sad as a maiden aunt and frightening as a witch. Happy Halloween. So runs this traditional patriarchal thinking. And he takes great pains to deconstruct that notion and finds it in Western history and deconstructs it. So, thought we'd end with Hesse from Reflections, because it seems to sum up what we've seen in our survey. We must become so alone, so utterly alone, that we withdraw into our innermost self. It is a way of bitter suffering. Yes, it is. But then our solitude is overcome. We are no longer alone, for we find that our innermost self is the Spirit, and that is God, and that it is God, the indivisible. And suddenly we find ourselves in the midst of the world, yet undisturbed by its multiplicity. That's the key, right? Retreat, return, but don't return as you were. For our innermost soul, we know ourselves to be one with all being. All right. Happy Halloween.